So moving into an existential perspective, this is really coming from a philosophy background, which we know psychology is really inherently based in philosophical thought. From an existential perspective, and the work of existential psychologists like Viktor Frankl or Irv Yalom, self-deception emerges because of a desire to avoid some of the givens of life, the most essential realities of being human that all of us have to confront over this lifetime. And in general, you'll hear existentialists talk about four givens, four realities that all of us have to confront. The first is aloneness, that we are born into this world as a single solitary body, and we will die as a single solitary body. And so you are ultimately alone as a human being, even though we so much need relationships to thrive and grow and evolve, that at the end of the day, you are alone. You are one single solitary human. The second is death. You're going to die, I'm going to die, and all of the people that you know and love are going to die. And that is just a very difficult part of the human journey. Third, meaninglessness, that our lives as humans actually don't have any inherent meaning. And four, freedom. We are who we choose to be. We have the freedom of choice. And because we have the freedom of choice, when there's something about your life that you don't like, the first place to look is in the mirror at yourself. Now, these givens may sound really harsh, but from an existential perspective, they're not intended to be harsh. They're actually intended to reflect reality, to reflect the true nature of the human condition, of the human experience. And actually, when we embrace them, when we embrace the idea that we are ultimately alone, that we're all going to die, that we don't have inherent value or inherent meaning in our lives, but we have the freedom of choice, the ideal, the goal of that is for people to be motivated to create a meaningful life for them. So the goal is when you confront these realities, you now have this wonderful opportunity to say, well, what gives me meaning? Who do I choose to be? And what will I be able to do with my life such that at the end of it, I actually don't have regret. I will actually confront death and be able to say, did I live the life that I needed to live for me? But as you might imagine, as you hear me talk about this, that is a very daunting task. That is a very scary task for all of us as humans, existentialists would argue. And so we create all kinds of deceptive realities to avoid that responsibility, to avoid that reality. For example, the specialness fallacy. This is that tendency that our clients, and certainly we all have, to say, oh, that could never happen to me. That's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to be robbed. I'm not going to be cheated. I'm not going to get a terminal illness. I'm not going to lose a child. I'm not. It can't happen to me. I can't be defrauded. Any of those things that we say, oh no, it'll happen to somebody else. I'm not possibly that outlier, is coming from a deceptive tendency to want to feel special and somehow uniquely protected from harm that could happen to any of us at any point. Avoiding death. The existentialists would argue that we lie to ourselves often by trying to avoid conversations about death, by trying to not write a will, by trying to not think about, am I living the life today that I need to live because I might die tomorrow? And if you keep that I might die tomorrow or I might die today in your mind, the idea is then you will live a meaningful life. Then you will be motivated to do your best and to craft something that's inherently valuable to you. But most of us don't want to do that because it's really scary to think about dying for most humans. Or an external search for meaning. So this idea that it's easy to look outside of ourselves for validation and meaning. It's easy to want to buy the next great thing so that we look important from a social perspective. It's easy to want to hear other people validate that we're right, or that we're doing a good job, or that we're actually this successful, lovely human, instead of saying it's wonderful or bad, whatever the outside environment thinks of me. But actually, I derive my meaning internally through what I believe is right, through my own conclusions about myself. And finally, deferring responsibility. Taking responsibility for our own choices and our own experiences in life is so profoundly difficult. And from an existential perspective, we all want to say, I am this way because of X, because I was in a bad job, a bad relationship, I had a difficult upbringing, not because of the choices that I'm making in my life today that actually are 100% my responsibility. And so in general, we want to defer responsibility for difficult aspects of our lives or dysfunction in our lives in ways that are actually quite dishonest. And I'm just going to go over one more orientation because I hope some of these resonate with you. And that is the multicultural perspective. I think this is a really, really important one for all of us to consider with all of our clients, obviously, because being culturally competent is so essential to being a good mental health provider. But from the work of many, many people, including Daryl Sue and Janet Helms, you can look at the anthropological researchers as well. They don't just need to be mental health individuals. Self-deception is most easily understood through cultural and social conditioning. So it's this idea that we're all raised in a cultural context, whether we like it or not. We were born in an era, in a generation, in a country, in a language, in a race and ethnic makeup. And from that cultural context, we will grow up essentially accepting whatever the norms and values of our cultural context are from a very young age without critically thinking about whether they're true or not, or whether we personally believe that they're true or not. And because that's just part of what we do, we are cultural beings. From the time we are very young, we will look around and we will start learning and we will start internalizing what our cultural context says makes us valuable, makes us desired, makes us healthy. We will emulate those norms and ideals unless we pause and critically think about what we learned and whether we think it's true or not. So some of the most common ways that we lie to ourselves from a multicultural perspective are acceptance of norms. Just accepting that there is a way to be that is reflected in our cultural context and that that's how we should be and how people should be. So, for example, in the United States, it's really normative to be fiercely independent. It's normative to learn that you should finish high school at 18, go to college, find a mate, a single mate, be heterosexual, get married, have a family, have a job, and that's sort of the way to have a successful life. And we may encounter ourselves or people around us who sort of go through those motions because they just accepted that that's the way to be, instead of critically thinking about, is this the way that I want to be? Or is this the way that I think is in the best interest of my community? This gets perhaps more important when you think about another way that we lie to ourselves culturally, which is internalization of cultural values. What I mean by that is when we personally apply the value system of a cultural context to ourselves and our relationships without really, again, thinking about whether it's true or accurate. So in the United States, for example, we all know that we have a long history of racism and sexism and classism and homophobism and ageism and weight-based discrimination. We have all of these values that are really perpetuated throughout our cultural system. And if we accept those and apply them without saying, why does this exist? And do I agree that currently it makes sense that being white is better than being non-white, or being a man is better than being a woman, or that my physical appearance determines my value as a human being? That if you internalize those without asking, where did I learn this? And what's the history behind it? And how can I work with myself to challenge internalized values and beliefs that I clearly seem to think are true, but actually when I unpack them and look at them, objectively, rationally, really know to be false? And how is that affecting me and my relationships and my community and my country and my culture as a whole? Because we have to be willing to do that if we're going to dismantle the isms of domination that can very negatively influence both the people who have the dominant power-based trait and the people who are on the negative discriminatory end of the power-based trait. I also want to highlight here that one of the ways that we lie to ourselves when we're in a position of power is that that power becomes invisible to us. So when I talk about isms of domination, isms of discrimination, racism, sexism, classism, if we're on the trait side that has the power, it's very easy for us not to even realize that there is a power discrepancy, that there is a problem, that there is something that may be negatively affecting others, because we're never confronted with the negative consequences when we have the power. And so from a multicultural perspective, our clients and all of us may be very unaware of how a position of power or how a position of not having power can affect the way that we view the world. And as treatment providers, this is exceptionally important when we're working with clients who are experiencing discrimination in a way that we may not personally experience or may not personally understand, so that we don't shy away from those conversations and we don't pretend that something isn't happening, but instead lean in to those difficult conversations and ask questions about, what did you learn? What is your experience? Are you affected by discrimination? Am I, as a white female therapist, somehow not understanding you or even doing things that make you uncomfortable that I can learn about and work from? This doesn't mean that we put all of the responsibility on the person who doesn't have the power. I have to say that with an asterisk, right? Like, this isn't about making a racial minority BIPOC individual or someone who's struggling with not having power in their lives responsible for educating all of us. But what it does mean is that when we have power, we may not even be aware that we're not addressing it or asking about it or working with it. And we, the therapists, have to be willing to open the door for those potentially difficult conversations in order to unpack where the learning happened and where the self-deception may be coming from.